This is my first time at AEC, but I grew up Conservative Baptist in Northern California, and so it was my world from the time I was in second grade till I graduated from college. And so, and then our church that I attend now used to be CBA until several years ago. Anyway, so we're family. My name is Tim Anderson, and I teach at Corban University. Been there a couple years. This is year 35. And so I've taught some of your children and some of you, and it was a great privilege to do so. Thank you for entrusting yourselves and your children to us at Corban. And so this topic on Alzheimer's is part of a trajectory. I've written one book, and then I have two other books that I started to outline. Once you get going, you just feel like there's more to say about theology and stuff, as we say, and yet those didn't really capture me like my first project did. And so I did a paper based on a family member's experience with bipolar. And so I did something for a conference a couple years ago on bipolar and moral responsibility. And so when someone has a mental illness, how responsible are they for the moral choices that they make? And I figured I'd take bipolar because it's kind of right in the middle, where you get the idea with somebody with schizophrenia that they aren't always all there, right? And so are they really responsible when they're, we would say, deliberative machinery is short-circuited? And so it was a tremendous project, but when I finished my presentation and allowed for questions and answers, number one, there was a lot of people that came, but also you could just tell from their questions that so many unanswered questions and so much pain because of mental illness. And so the Lord has kind of pushed me on a trajectory to doing a biblical theology of mental illness, because as you can sense in the church today, there is a wide range of opinions and theologies and practices on this. And so last November, I wrote this paper, and so this is a condensed version in 4 10-point font pages of a 12-page with footnotes document. So at the top, if you'd like the full meal deal, just email me and I'll send you a copy. Pray for me, because by the end of the month I have to do a paper proposal for this next November's conference, and that's really what keeps me writing because of life and ministry. And so and I feel like the Lord really wants me to write on mental illness and spiritual warfare. And there is a broad range of perspectives on that. Everything from hyper-Pentecostals who don't believe in any sort of physiological issues, to Roman Catholic exorcists, to people who are just completely secular, even Christians who don't believe in any of that stuff because we've drank the Kool-Aid of our culture, and yet I would say that there's probably a mediating position in there somewhere. But the proposal, 300 words, which you got to, and I assess proposals for this conference, and so you don't want to say something stupid because you won't get accepted, and anyway, and then I have to write under sheer self-discipline, which probably won't happen. Anyway, so thanks for coming, and I know already that when I pulled up to register yesterday, and I mentioned, they mentioned that I'll be doing the Alzheimer's, and I'm so glad. They said, I said to them, I am? And then they said, yeah, my father has it. And I said, oh, too soon, huh? Yeah, too soon. So I've had that joke a lot, and yet I try to be sensitive because I think that in a room this size, I can pretty much guarantee that you know somebody and I've experienced that personally. This is in many ways dedicated to my mother-in-law, my wife's mother, who had that set of symptoms where she was still the same sweet, compliant lady who still cheated at solitaire, but was, hard to take care of. She would wander, and yet my uncle, my dad's brother, who was a godly man, evangelist, teacher, professional, but evangelist, an elder at his Plymouth Brethren church, he became belligerent and violent. And so radically different in that area. And so I felt like we needed to work through this. And in light of the approaches to the problem of evil and suffering, I've been told by some and that certain branches of biblical counseling need to really work on their view of the problem of evil and suffering, especially its effects physiologically. And so having had two of my family members counseled that basically their impression was you just need to read the Bible and pray more, when both of those family members have physiological issues that medications actually make a huge difference. Obviously, that's not all that there is to it. So in this, I just wanted to kind of give you an intro to know where we're going, and I know that if you're going to come to this, there probably is a variety of reasons why, but I know that I wanted you to kind of hear in some of the ways I hear and see you. At the same time, I hope that I can spur some thoughts theologically so that we can build upon other issues as well from this area. So I actually was going to teach a class a year and a half ago on the problem of evil and suffering. And it was canceled because I didn't have quite enough enrollment, and one of the students actually died during the summer. And so that definitely was a kind of a shock, and also recognizing firsthand that this is the kind of world in which we live. So this handout, I just wanted you to know, and I'm not going to make a joke like some of you will forget everything that I say, so I had to write it down. I'm not going to make that joke, but I think sometimes when I go to conferences, a broad outline for some can be really helpful, but for some who just want to stick it in a file for later use and thoughts around a series, to kind of get your footing or to kind of get a different perspective, that's what this handout's for, okay? So I was not going to do the 12-page single-space one on the school's dime already. I put it to the wrong printer, and it was printing off single-sided without stapling, and was running out of, it was just, I felt the copy machine was demon-possessed. But I wanted you to have something in your hands. It is kind of interesting at the same time that I'm working on this, is that our church has been going through a series called God's Unseen Hand. And it's their attempt to walk through key passages and people in the Bible where God's unseen hand is described for us as the best the Bible does to us humans when it's trying to communicate God's, as we would say, meticulous providence. So if you're thinking about a series that might help your people, I think that's probably a potential for the future, rather than just going verse by verse through the book of Job, right? So The Unseen Hand is our church series at salemheightschurch.org, and so the pastoral staff has been doing a great job. So Okay, so let's begin, and I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what we're doing at the very beginning and why it's important. My main goal is three parts, and one, I want to kind of describe some of the issues related to Alzheimer's itself, Alzheimer's disease. Just so you know, the common misnomer, when I did this presentation, I have a dear friend that we were in our doctoral programs together, and he is also a clinical psychologist and got his PhD at Cal Berkeley. And so he said, yeah, Tim, I really appreciate your paper. He said, this was in November. Friday will be the 5-year anniversary of my father's passing, and he had Alzheimer's. I just want to correct one thing you had to say was that people don't die from Alzheimer's. They die from the complications that are part of that process. So when we say we understand what we mean, and in some sense, people die from Alzheimer's, but they don't really. All right, it's not something that kills you, but I'll show you some pictures here in a second about what it actually does to the brain. So with that as well is that this title, Why Would God Allow Us to Lose Our Minds? And then Wandering Through a Theodicy of Alzheimer. So the second thing I want to cover in our time together today is work through the idea of a theodicy. This is something growing up and even into my doctoral program that I didn't really address. I didn't really have this addressed for me. And so it's become kind of a thing for me, because when I teach apologetics to undergrad and grad students at Corban, we have to go through the problem of evil and suffering. It is if it's not the top of the list, it's number 2 on reasons why people refuse to believe in God. And so I was at giving blood, and this lady noticed that I had James Sire's The Universe Next Door, and it's a book on a Christian book on worldviews. And she says, "Oh, what is that?" And I said, "It's on worldviews." "Oh, we need to understand that." And I said, "So I love this question. So what's your religious background?" She says, "Well, my dad was an agnostic and my mom was an atheist." And I said, "So your mom, an atheist, was there something that happened in her life that just kind of pushed her in that direction?" And she looked at me like, "How did you?" And she said, "How did you know that?" Really? You know? And she said, well, she never really would talk about it, but there was some bad event in her life that said, I can't believe in a God that would allow that. And so I've had this conversation over and over again. So wandering through a theodicy of Alzheimer's. So a theodicy is from 2 Greek words, one, theos, which is God, and dike is that famous word group in Romans that you don't even have to know Greek, just go through there and look at the dik word group and you'll see it. It's just, fair, or righteous. So how can God be just, fair, or righteous and allow X, Y, and Z? Okay? So that's what we're talking about. And then wandering, well, we're going to wander, all right? And obviously one of the major symptoms of Alzheimer's is wandering. Books have been written on that phenomenon and why and what to do about it. And so, but I want us to recognize that as a theologian, that's my craft, that's my hobby, that's my calling. I shepherd God's people theologically from the Bible. That is who I am. That's my sense of what my job is, and but I don't have all the answers to this, okay? Just so you know, if you've come for the answer, I'll give you answers because I think the Bible does to some extent, but I think we're going to be left with some mystery as well. But the final part is, since we're wandering, I want us to wander to implications and principles that the famous defenses for the existence of evil and suffering in the world and the theodicies that have been crafted for us by our forefathers, I think they leave us with some clear principles about how to move forward. And because this is about shepherding people, right? This is not just about getting the right answer or satisfying our curiosity or the deep burning, unsatisfied longings for the why. So with this, it's kind of interesting with the wandering. There was a man who was working with Alzheimer's patients, and this one lady escaped, so to speak, one night, and it was a freezing cold night, and she went off, and she was finally found outside without appropriate clothing on, shivering, brought her back in, and asked her if she knew that she had wandered off, and her response was, "No, but I'll never do that again." So she doesn't really know, you know what I'm saying? And yet she knows, but she doesn't know. And so and with the apologetic angle, you might have heard of a guy named Lee Strobel, but we'll get to him in a minute. I just want to remind you that this is a thing in our culture. So if you think about it, 6.7 million people have been diagnosed with living with Alzheimer's in America. There's over 10 million diagnosed, and obviously it's probably more than that around the world. In comparison to 1 million with Parkinson's. And then 1 in 9 people over 65, and one of the attendant things that people are really beginning to write about is the worry of the potential. 5%, 65 to 73, or 74, 13.1%, 75 to 84, and then 33%, 85 years old or older. Yes, Nick?
Did you say 7 million, almost 7 million in America and 10 million worldwide?
Yeah.
So more than half of the world population with diagnosed Alzheimer's in the U.S.?
And I would say that's diagnosed, so we don't really know exactly, but that's just what the stats say on the 2023 Alzheimer's Foundation big facts and figures study that they did.
What about the percentage of those that are under 65 that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's?
I'll show you that in just a second. Thank you. Good segue, because it's that right there. All right. Thank you for that segue, keeping us moving. All right, and so this is 55 million with dementia, with Alzheimer's leading the leading cause. But again, a lot of times, and you may have heard this, is that it's very difficult to diagnose, though we're getting better at it with some genetics and proteins that can be identified. But until very, very recently, you basically had dementia, and then the only way you could really determine was through an autopsy whether or not somebody had Alzheimer's. And so, and it would be very clear, as I will show you here. So you might have heard of Lee Strobel in his Case for Faith conversation, and there's Lee, and he has this conversation with the former evangelist Charles Templeton. Do you remember this story in the book? How many have read The Case for Christ, or The Case for Faith? It's a tremendous series, but he said this when he was interviewing him as someone who, this is in the very beginning of the book. Strobel asked him, would you like to believe, because this man turned from God after being, in many ways, one of the key evangelists at the beginning of Billy Graham's career. They were both very significant leaders in this burgeoning new evangelical movement. Said, oh, would you like to believe? Lee asked him. Of course, he exclaimed. If I could, I would. I'm 83 years old. I've got Alzheimer's. I'm dying, for goodness sake. But I've spent my life thinking about it, and I'm not going to change now. Hypothetically, if someone came up to me and said, look, old boy, the reason you're ill is God's punishment for your refusal to continue on the path your feet were set in. Would that make any difference to me? He answered himself emphatically, no, he declared, no, there cannot be in our world a loving God. His eyes locked with mine, cannot be. So I want us to work first through briefly what is Alzheimer's, and then second, I want us to look through first, what does the Bible talk about Alzheimer's? Where does it come from? And you're going, well, I didn't think the Bible addresses mental illness at all. Well, it does and it doesn't. I tell my students, everything is theological. Everything. Our use of styrofoam cups is theological. The creation of styrofoam cups is theological. Why? First, God created us in His image to be able to be creative, and we can make styrofoam cups for the benefit of mankind. Then also the use of styrofoam cups, because being made in God's image implies what? Creation care. And so you can't just rip it all up, throw it on the ground, and walk away. Christians don't do that, right? Because that's not good for the creation that we are designed to steward. And so everything is theological, and therefore everything about Alzheimer's is theological. So in working through this, so we're going to do that, then we're going to then finally do those principles at the end. So working through this, understanding AD and its neurological behavioral manifestations. So here we are. Basically what it is you can see on the left-hand side a healthy brain. And these are healthy neurons, which are the pathways that these electrical impulses go throughout the body, but they go from the brain and they go throughout and they go down our spinal column to our wonderful system. And then the Alzheimer's brain, notice anything different. And what ends up happening is, for some unknown reason, they're still trying to figure it out, is that there's these proteins that form, and they become these plaques, and these plaques begin to adhere themselves to these neurons, and they begin to choke them so that they can no longer receive the nourishment that they need as living cells, right? As a result, they die. Plus, one of the other attendant circumstances is that these neurons begin to develop tangles or frayed parts of them, and those also make it so that the transference of the electrical impulses that the brain has no longer work. So basically what happens? The brain begins to die, slowly, bit by bit. And so you see in your notes that there are a couple of things that go with that. Tangible losses: aphasia, the deterioration of language; paroxia, impaired ability for execution of motor activities, and you know the Alzheimer's shuffle, right? And then agnosia, failure to recognize or identify objects, especially people. This is what ends up terrifying people about what can happen, and this is what makes it so difficult. So as you begin to look at these healthy neurons, you begin to see the plaques. These are the healthy neurons with those sheaths that go around, and then but then they begin to have these frayed edges, and they stop working, and they start to deteriorate. It's so sad, and in some ways terrifying. So with this, there's also these concerns of those with Alzheimer's. And so you can see that the person affected has attendant concerns, fear, regret, anger, resentment. I mean, think about somebody who has been diagnosed, who has their life ahead of them, and they have things they want to do, and they have family members that they want to take care of or impact. Devastating. But then also, they begin to have those implications about why God would allow that. And that they revolve around these three terms: personhood, autonomy, and burden. Personhood: I'm no longer a person. My true self I'm going to lose myself. And then autonomy: I can't make my own decisions. Somebody will have to make my decisions for me. I have no ideas what I'm going to be doing. And then the burden I place on others. Do you see what I'm saying here as far as why this is so difficult as an issue to address? Why would God allow something like that? But if we don't enter in, like our speaker said even this morning, if we don't enter into the suffering, even have Christ in the corner of the room and let it fly, just get it out there, God can take it, And we need to be able to express without hiding our thoughts, but never just leave it there. But we need to make sure that we enter into the people's worlds. So many other illustrations I could tell you, but we need to keep moving. So with this, the Alzheimer's and the fall, and you can see this incredible stained glass depiction of the fall. And I get this answer from my students every time I teach apologetics. This coming fall, students will be, toward the end of the semester, asked to write a research paper. And the simple assignment is, you must write a paper that says, why would God allow ... and you need to give something, anything that you think is important. So they've addressed rape, they've addressed wildfires, they've addressed tsunamis, school shootings, they've addressed a whole bunch of things. And so with this, in reading their papers over and over again, me reading their papers, the easiest answer is to go, well, it's the fall. Blame it on Adam. Got to blame it on somebody. The problem is, if you don't connect the dots after that, it sounds, as we would say, disingenuous. You know that term? It sounds callous, unfeeling. You just did the Bible trump card. And so that doesn't end the conversation. So what I want us to do is kind of maybe connect the dots a little bit more. And so I just want to read this paragraph to you. First, AD is rooted in the fall of Adam and Eve into sin. Without explanation, this concept can seem insincere and unfair. However, every worldview has its own origin story, and if the Christian God is going to be challenged, it's only fair to allow the story he tells to be admitted into evidence. Amen? And so, continuity linking this past event to now is Adam served as a representative of the human race. Probation. He was my substitute. Why? Because God knew that if I was in the garden, I'd act at some point in the same way. Romans 5, right? There had to be one man as the substitute and one man who ultimately became the substitute, right? And so Adam serves as a representative of demonstration the finite humans could never make consistently perfect moral choices throughout an entire lifetime. Adam serves as a representative of moral free will, but of moral culpability for disobedience to the Creator. And so you see that famous passage in Romans 5:12. Death is the devastating penalty all humanity now pays. Now what's death. But I want you to be thinking about how death unfolds, say, in the book of Genesis. It unfolds with, first, animals dying. Last time I heard that when skins of animals are made, the animal has to die, right? And then the next chapter, Cain killed Abel, Lamech killed, and then it goes on from there. And then you have the earth filled with violence and sin, and that only their thoughts are their only evil continually, right? So God has to push hard reset. Why? Violence assumes what? Death and suffering, physical suffering. And then you see in Genesis 5, and so begat so-and-so, and he died. But so-and-so lived so many years, right? And so then by the time you get to Genesis 10, you start to see the decline in age. Why? Physiological effects of the fall. Death is sooner. So all of a sudden you see it's 180, 175, then 120, and then you get Psalm 90, which is some 70, some 80, right? So connecting the dots for people, and even for ourselves first, we need to go, it's not just Adam sinned, boom. No, it brought the effects of the fall physiologically, not just spiritually, on all humanity. And they didn't just die and keel over or end at the end of their lives. There are a multitude of ways. Plus, as you begin to think about physiological effects, God created, by the way, if you're a homeschooler or if you've got kids or in public school or whatever, and they have not started to work through this as far as the effects of the fall on the devolution of mankind, think about, there's a great book by a guy named Gillen, it's called The Genesis of Germs. And he basically, from a Christian worldview perspective, shows where disease comes from. It's super helpful, and it's basically a curriculum kind of style book that is like, yeah, good for you. Connect the dots for us, rather than just kind of thinking of, there's science and then there's the Bible. No, they are wonderfully interwoven. So with that, then the theodicy of disease, you can see that in your handout at the bottom of the page, and we work through that. But I want to also then work through this issue of natural evil. Now, natural evil, at the same time, there is this sense called religious evil, which is basically when people disobey God and evil comes. There's also moral evil, which is a kind of a subcategory of that. It's when people make a choice. Humans choose to do evil, and it affects their relationship with God, and it also reflects and influences their how they affect other people. So we begin to look through the history of the world, and moral choices are everything that has gone wrong with the human race. There's also, though, as we know from thorns and thistles, etc., and the futility of the ground and human disease, we see natural evil. So at the same sense, we see there is tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes, earthquakes, fires, natural disasters, tornadoes and lightning, hurricanes, devastating. And yet at the same time, we forget that there's another part of natural evil. And these are what are called things that are happening with disease, right? Cancer, for example, is part of that devolution process, which goes directly against the second law of anyway, whatever. You got that idea. So I'm not a big fan of evolution, just so you know. Corban is not as well. All right. So theodicy of disease, that was a shameless promotion. All right. So I want to give you a couple of famous solutions to the problem of evil and suffering. And when we talk about this, this is where we go, yeah, I believe that. Oh, I believe that too. I don't believe that one as well. And I think that what ends up happening is that we need to recognize that there are strengths to many of these, and yet there are weaknesses. Because if there was one, then we could just share that and say, there you go. And people would go, oh, okay, you got me on that one. They're not going to do that, right? And it's not just because they have a hard heart. It's just because some of these all of these have some roadblock that you get to a certain point and you just go, I can't go any farther, and it's not ultimately satisfying. But we'll get to that, about what to do about that when we get to our principles at the end, right? So the first one is God's punishment defense. This is the oldest and in many ways the most popular. And when I was in Cameroon a couple years ago, and I was on the local Christian radio station, and because I know about the deeply rooted sense of cause and effect in their culture, is that I spoke on the issue about why evil comes, and that it's not always about whether or not somebody did something wrong, because often in tribal religions, if you don't do the right thing and the spirits find out, and you haven't appeased them rightly, well then guess what? Your child's going to get sick, there's going to be a flood in your village, or the local next tribe is going to come and attack you because it was your fault. So, but again, why would God allow AD? Because he causes it directly or indirectly as punishment for someone doing something wrong. Two famous passages. If you don't understand these passages, then you probably don't have as robust a view of the theodicy and the problem of evil and suffering as we should. And that would be number one, the book of Job. His three friends came, and each one in those cycles, in the main part of the book, in the middle, Job, you must have sinned. It's your fault. By the way, think about prosperity gospel and those who believe in faith healing. You know why you didn't get healed. Because you didn't have enough faith or there's sin in your life. It's your fault. Well, it may be, but how do you know? Especially if they've confessed. So, and by the way, the first verse of Job kind of dismantles that, right? There was a man, his name was Job, from Uz, where they used to make many machine guns, Uzis. And but then he was what? Yeah, he was blameless and upright and in favor with God and favor with men, right? And it was basically saying, so just in case you're wondering if it was something he did wrong about why these horrible things are happening, guess again, all right? And so when you get down to it, there's this term in Ecclesiastes, hebel, you know that term, which is vanity or meaninglessness, and it can be used, by the way, positively as well as negatively. And my translation of it is, it just doesn't make sense. That's the wisdom literature. And so I think that we need to recognize that there's things where at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, what do we do when it's all said and done? But we'll get there, all right? So we recognize that this is this completely false, though? No. Do you think that people are suffering sometimes because of what they did? Yeah. Can it be a direct judgment from God? Yeah. In every case, no, right? And so we need to be very careful about proclaiming knowledge about things where, yeah, okay. Second one, natural evil is negation defense. This is like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. This is that famous negation. And you might have seen darkness is the absence of light, and those videos on YouTube, you know, about how the child stumps the professor and which are supposedly it's Albert Einstein, which is really wasn't, and just go to Snopes.com, you know. Anyway, but the point is that he's onto something. God created the world, and yet at the same time, there's the potential for lacks or misuse or the opposite, and that would be good health or shalom. By the way, an excellent book on the problem of evil and suffering is Cornelius Plantinga's book, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a breviary on sin, money. It's called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be. And so God allows it into his creation. At the same time, think about what this ends up happening, especially in light of much of the theology we recognize about God's providence, is that there's got to be more to it than that. God it's almost deistic, right? Well, let's just see how it plays out. And then couldn't he have intervened and made certain laws different? But he didn't. And God's not chained to natural law. He has very specific purposes. We see that a lot in the scriptures about why certain evils happen. Well, in those cases, yeah, well, that violates this rule. So I think it does say something about the world in which we live, but I don't think it says everything about why God would allow it. God allowed the brain to be able to devolve and deteriorate because of the fall of Adam. That's it? Well, then we're back to the punishment thing. That doesn't seem to be right. Well, everybody's a sinner. Okay. Yeah, but is that really the reason? Well, they just get caught up in a fallen world. So God just... I think the scriptures give us more than that. So, and by the way, I'm still wrestling like this with you are, right? So, natural law defense. Why Alzheimer's disease? Because God created a world designed to function by natural laws that can have good and adverse consequences, resulting from the proper or improper use of these laws by humans. That's very similar to the previous one, right? So why couldn't he do it differently? Well, he didn't. So he didn't have a plan? I think he did. Free will defense, probably one of the most common ones, especially if you're anti-Calvinist, right? Or Arminian, or whatever. And there's a mediating position called Molinism by William Lane Craig, and I don't really want to get into that because I still think it has problems as well. But anyway, the point is this is probably one of the most famous ones, because God risks the possibility of evil to allow humans to benefit free choice versus being robots. I think that there's an element of truth to that, don't you think? And yet at the same time, in your paper, you see that I love the statement by Keller. And by the way, does anybody else besides me miss Tim Keller? He was one of my lawn mowing mentors. I'm just saying. If they weren't so long, he would be my elliptical and bike morning mentor, but that's Alistair Begg, all right? So anyway, and you can't not love his Scottish brogue, anyway, so just in case you're wondering. All right, but notice what it says here it says, God could have violated free will in the beginning, yet he could have sufficiently good reasons for allowing the painful suffering of AD, reasons beyond mere providing and preserving free will, Keller. C.S. Lewis cautions overemphasizing human free will, calling it an absurdity which may arise if we talk too much about God planning and creating the world process for good, and that of being frustrated by the free will of creatures. So, I don't think God's frustrated. So, yeah. And so then the greater good theodicy. Now, we're going to come back to this when we get to our principles in just a minute. And so, but I want to give you some time for questions here in a second. But this natural evil has some resulting good that it justifies existence. Goods logically counterbalance evil in some way. By the way, Leibniz said that it was God's best possible world that creates the best possible results out of whatever God created. Now we're getting someplace. I don't think this answers all the questions, but I think that theologically we're getting someplace. But at the same time, think about when there's got to be a good that comes out of Alzheimer's.
I was just thinking, all of this is kind of throwing out Romans 8:28. That even in all of this, that God will still cause good to come out of it.
Yeah. And so we need to think about, and by the way, does anybody know if you think about Old Testament passages, does that sound a whole lot like another passage in Genesis 50:20, right? You meant it, intended it for evil, O Hitler youth brothers of mine who sold me into human trafficking. But God what? Intended it. What? God intends things for good and evil? What? So we've got work to do. So finally, there's also soul making, which is very similar to the goods, that God does this to create the best possible souls on this earth, because we know that often we don't change unless there's suffering, right? No pain, no gain. We won't move unless somebody moves us. We won't recoil unless somebody pricks us. And yet at the same time, don't you think that some people, because of the suffering that they've experienced, go the opposite way? So that doesn't seem to make sense as well. So I think that this is probably the best overarching one and yet I don't want it to sound disingenuous either or callous, but I think theologically we're on better footing when we say because it brings God the greatest glory than if it didn't exist. This is a combination of the greater good and best possible world defense. Why do I put those two together? Because I think that people are holding to this are going, the other ones have strengths to them. We can't just throw them out, but is there more to it than that? Is there a step back we can say, I don't always understand all of this, and I never will because I'm not omniscient. And I tell my students, you have the permission to not be omniscient, especially when you do evangelism and apologetics, you know? And I think God gives us permission to not be omniscient as well. And yet, I think that there are too many passages that push us in this direction, that there's got to be something better that he's doing, and it can't be just to preserve free will. It can't be that it was just the best possible universe of counterfactuals, whatever that means, okay? Ask William Lane Craig, right? But I think here's the logic. God's ultimate purpose in creating the world is his glory. And I think that we all kind of understand that in our heart of hearts, but do we really believe it? Do we really believe that that's what the Bible teaches? And then God's glory is supremely magnified in the atoning work of Christ. And by the way, if you think about those passages in Ephesians 1, to the praise of his glorious grace, to the praise of his glorious grace, to the praise of his glorious grace, about what? The redemption of humanity. Thought about in eternity past. 1:4. And then, redemption is unnecessary unless the fall. Duh. But yeah. And then finally, therefore, the fall is necessary to God's ultimate purpose in creating the world. By the way, I was going to require this book, and you're going, whoa, that's a doorstop. Yeah, it is. What About Evil by Scott Christensen? But by the way, in a book this size, very readable. It can get a little dense at times as far as the philosophy, but he handles it very well. And just so you know, if you think about philosophy, but you think about it very biblically, the guy graduated from the Master's Seminary. So he's not going to pepper this with scriptural data. I mean, he's just going to do that. You're going to just see his biblical arguments rising to the surface over and over again. It's called What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory by Scott Christensen. And I got to meet him in November, and he's just this humble associate pastor in outside of San Antonio. He just happened to be an award-winning architect before he went to seminary. And he's sharp. Oh my goodness. I've been a fan of his, and I didn't even know who he was for years. But I want us to be thinking about this. So I had this student come by last week. Goes to our church, but she's in our bioethics class, and she heard that I had been writing on these things. Can I have a copy of your paper, Dr. Anderson? I say, sure. So let me know what you think. And so she came by. Can I talk to you? And she started and she's grown up in the church. Her parents are godly, and her dad's an elder, and her mom's a church pianist, and she's super great student in our health sciences program. And she just goes, how can God want stuff for his glory? Doesn't that sound a little, I said, egotistical? Yeah. It's like those college and professional football players when they score a touchdown. You know, it's like, is that really what God wants? Well, I hope that you and I understand about God's glory, because this is a struggle for many people. God just seems like he's an egomaniac. And yet at the same time, God's glory is, if he didn't show it, we'd miss out. What did Piper say over and over again? God is most glorified when we're most satisfied in him. How's that going to happen? Through the need to sustain and satisfy our satisfactions, even in the midst of horrific suffering. So if it's like the sun, God's glory is the sun. Is he really all that deserving? Yeah. Think about it. The sun, number one, is it is rightfully the center of our solar system. Amen? And if we didn't have that, we'd be spinning off someplace else in cold black space. But if you think about it, even Jonathan Edwards said that the dark side of this is just the opposite of reflecting the glory of God. It's not God's fault. He's not the one who causes suffering. It's the lack of. So, finally, AD in the fall and its personhood, and basically this is people's desire to grapple with the fact that they're going to lose themselves. Back to our question again. Why would God allow us to lose our minds? Because that's losing ourself, especially in the West. It's your identity. We're all about that. Lose myself, the center of who I am. I might as well not live anymore. Unplug me, give me a lethal injection, call Dr. Death, go to Oregon. But there's a creator that made you in his image that knows exactly who you are, and you will never lose that. And I developed this about what I think is the image of God, and it's not just that I have it, I am it. And we never lose it. And so that solves everything. So principles. First of all, trust. Again, I don't want this to be sounding disingenuous or callous, but at the same time, if you think about a parent and a child, the child will do anything, or most anything, if they trust their parents, right? Well, why don't we trust God? And so the direct answer to why God would allow AD must include trusting in the biblical storyline of God's redemptive glory as the theme of the best of all possible worlds. In God's plan, redemption requires evil. And it goes on from there. There's this passage in Acts 2:23, just in case you're wondering, God predetermined the fall. Do you remember this? He planned it. It wasn't an accident. But sometimes we think it, whoops, or okay, this is how the story is unfolding. Remember Acts 2:23, men of Israel, 22, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst. As you yourselves know, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite, New American Standard, preset plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God's meticulous providence and yet moral responsibility of evil people making moral decisions. How it all works, I think it's a mystery in some way, but we go from there. And so this is where we get back to that hebo concept in the book of Ecclesiastes. It just doesn't make sense. It's vanity. Not like pessimistic existentialist vanity or meaninglessness, but it's like, it just doesn't make sense. And yet, what's the end? Fear God and keep His commandments. That's what we do. We trust Him. And then finally, I give you another example, an illustration there of, this is, you got to listen to this part. I'm sorry, but John Feinberg was a dear man. He's still alive, but he was my professor and my first reader on my dissertation at Trinity. And he wrote this book called Deceived by God, A Journey Through Suffering. And it's really the story about how his wife started having physiological effects that were disturbing, and then she was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, this neurodegenerative disease that will basically, I don't think she's passed away yet, but she is just completely incapacitated in a care facility. And but the deceived by God part was that they thought that her mom, years before that, had a mental illness and she was institutionalized. And it wasn't until after they got married and had their children, their two boys, their boys were little, when they found out, no, her mom did not have a mental illness. Her mom had Huntington's. Passed on hereditary. So should they have even gotten married? Should they have had children? Knowing that all this was going to go on, one of his chapters is on knowing the future. worth the price of the book. Or this chapter here, when he talks about, in his chapter, Recipes for Disaster, or how not to help the afflicted, he notes several things not to say, like, you must have committed some sin, or this has probably spared you from worse problems, or if you just change your view of God, everything would be fine, or just remember Romans 8:28, or we're all going to die someday, or you aren't spiritually mature about this unless you're happy about this. Well-meaning people, right? But this is why we teach. This is why we model. This is why we come alongside. And we shut up until the time is right? So when we trust God, that can mean we shut up, right? And so then care for attendant emotions and attitudes, you can just see all that can go with that, about the loss of self and the burden on caregivers and the loss of autonomy and so on and so forth. And then finally, a view from our eschatology. Problem of evil and suffering always has an eschatological piece. There's always another chapter. In light of what we heard this morning, and you and I can immediately, tears just in the throat tighten, because we know. And yet many of you go, but there's another chapter. There's always another chapter. So, with that, I'll let you read the rest of it. And so I just want to leave that for the end for any questions, okay? Any questions or comments or discussion points, or hopefully that was helpful in some way, at least to get us to think. Yes?
Theodicy change with self-inflicted harm, suicide, some of those terribly hard. It's not the genesis of a germ. It's not this thing God made. I had a father-in-law who passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease. You see that there's got to be some explanation for seemingly undeserved pain and suffering. What about self-inflicted wounds?
Yes, great question. Thank you so much. About self-inflicted, such as suicide. This is being recorded, that's why I'm saying this, but also I think it's helpful. Self-inflicted suffering. But I think that we recognize that suicide it always comes out of something. And there's a significant need. It's could be because of, say, somebody has bipolar 1, and that is the most severe form. And as a result, when they go high, they go for not just a couple of days or a couple of weeks. It can go for 3 months and then down, and then it can be 2 to 3 months down here. And the only way to make sense of it or to get it to stop is to take one's life. That's a push. That's living out of diminished capacity. Now, again, I think people are still morally responsible, but they are susceptible. I think that I have a good dear friend that his father found out that he was going to have a long, debilitating illness, and so he took his own life. And this is a godly man. But we need to, I think one of the things I learned through bipolar and in all of this is and that's why I start out with the science of Alzheimer's, is you got to have a proper diagnosis. And some of this we'll never know. But at the same time, I think that we recognize this is part of the fall. And I don't want to say that in a trite or callous way, but there are attendant forces. There is spiritual warfare. There is mental health issues, which I think they overlap but are not always identical with mental illness. And there are attendant circumstances that we know in the Bible. I wish I were dead, Jonah said. And Saul said the same thing. And so we recognize that there are circumstances, but they are always swirling around with the problem of the fall, and yet at the same time, that always shows the need for the gospel. Hopefully you're seeing through all of this that the great suffering of God, I believe God suffered. I do, and I think that at the same time, the gospel is where we always gravitate to. It's like trying to explain hell to a child. You know, if we just say hell is where all of us will go because we're sinners. No, we go to the gospel, right? And so, yes, thank you.
Do you have any thoughts on for the person who has Alzheimer's or something who's had a stroke or something, and it really just like alters their personality and their, like, they were the great godly person and now they're the horrible, rough, you know, like you wouldn't pick them out of a crowd of two to be the Christian.
Right.
Where does that put them? Where does it put them with God? Where does it put them with their eternal security? You know, all that stuff. Just a quick.
Yeah, I tried to address that a little bit in my bipolar paper because I'm concerned about that relationship, and I'm still. I think it's hard to discern, but I think that the issue is that those people, regardless of their mental state, are still made in God's image. They are still image bearers. So they should be protected from themselves, from others, and they should be given all the care that they need. So bottom line, we all understand that, but that's what makes, by the way, Christian medical missions so radically different than atheist aid societies, right? Because we believe that people are have inherent worth and dignity because they're creations of God. But as far as the incapacities, I think that there is diminished capacities, and then there's also where I remember when the care people were taking care of my dad when he was 95, and Dad started to say and do things that were inappropriate. I think some of it was post-surgery, some of it was he was on a decline. He did not have Alzheimer's. He did not have dementia. I just think he was on a decline. And they just told me, we know that's not Kenny, because I would apologize. I am so sorry for what he did. And I will talk to him. And I chided him. You cannot do that again. They will move you and put you into another place that's not as nice as this. And he didn't, but the thing that they said was, we know that's not Kenny. And so we need to just reckon that. I think where they are with God, I think that there's a severing. It's kind of like the mind and the soul. If the mind is the brain, and the brain, I don't think they're necessarily identical, but if the brain is not working, it's like the inability to speak. And so those things in the soul cannot be expressed. And then the soul, I don't know if it goes dormant or whatever. I think that's what God knows. But I think that there's this sense where something's broken. They can't communicate as they normally would. They would never say things like that. And I'm not going to say that this is something that, oh man, I've got to have my quiet times every day because otherwise I'm going to be a terror to my family. Or, man, I got to stop looking at certain kinds of things online because I know that when I start losing my mind, it's going to come out and everybody's going to think, oh yeah, that was, you know. Well, I just don't think we can know that. I think we need to care for them as they are and know that God is with them and that He cares for them more than we do, that there is a real physiological a break or a problem. They're broken, and they're still there, but something's broken.
Like the age of
I think, I mean, if you've taken care of an elderly parent, you know that there's a huge role reversal. I mean, you know what I'm saying? And so I am my father's son, just so you know. Okay, same weird sense of humor and stuff. So anyway, that's a great question, though. Both of you, thank you so much. I don't want to hold you hostage if you have plans or appointments, or you're starving and wanting to go to Pig and Pancake. I heard that they're having a Reuben today, which I had a stack of pancakes because I was feeling so sweet today. Anyway, that was for lunch. Yes?
So I was just going to ask what you might add to the question of, a lot of these are good theological responses, and then you brought in the emotional side of it. What is your counsel in terms of when you're visiting someone in a care home or something like that? When do you bring in the theological side of it versus the more just sitting and listening, like you said? How do you balance that?
Ask these pastors. They know. You don't always know, right? And you pray like crazy the whole time, and you are always recognizing that this doesn't have to be your only shot at it, unless it's at the end, and then it needs to be specific and directed. But I think that there always has to be a sense of compassion and valuing the person because God values them, saved or unsaved. And it really comes down to, I'm not going to share a lot of this unless they ask. If they start really having a struggle about why God would allow this, or a family member really struggles, I want to really tap the brakes and say, okay, now why, and are they asking this question? One of the things I ask my students to do when they do this assignment on why would God allow, they must first start with implied questions. What is it that they're really asking? Because you and I could just launch off into an area and it's like, well, that's not really what I was asking, right? And so we really need to be people who have emotional intelligence to be able to, by the Spirit of God and the fruit of the Spirit, and by the truth of the Scriptures, to really just say what's absolutely necessary. And then just remember that there can be other conversations. We don't have to solve it all for them. But we lead them, and again, it's always got to come back to the gospel. Always got to come back to the gospel. So, okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Any other questions you can ask me. My email's at the top if you'd like the full meal deal, paper, or the one with about Alzheimer's. And thank you for coming, and may the Lord bless you with those you minister to in these areas.